The candles flickered softly on the table, but the words she uttered, "There's someone else," set my entire world ablaze. The way she called me into the dining room was my first clue something was off. "Michael, come sit," she said, her voice sweet but unnervingly steady. Madison had always been the one to keep her cool in heated situations, but tonight wasn't heated. It was cold, calculated. The dining table was set for two, a spread of our favorite dishes laid out as if it was an anniversary or birthday dinner. But it wasn't. The date on the calendar meant nothing special. Still, I went along with it. I thought maybe it was her way of surprising me after a rough couple of weeks at work. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured the wine, an expensive bottle we'd been saving for years. It struck me as odd. Madison wasn't the nervous type. She had a steady hand, especially in moments like these, which only made the sight of her trembling fingers more unsettling. "Michael," she began, her eyes flitting between mine and the half-empty glass in front of her. "There's something I need to tell you." It was the kind of line that forces you to pause. My fork froze mid-air, the bite of roasted chicken forgotten. My mind raced ahead, conjuring every possible scenario. An illness, bad news about a relative, maybe even something about one of the kids. The last thing I expected was what came next. "I haven't been entirely honest with you," she said, her voice soft but deliberate. I felt my stomach drop. There was a weight in her words, the kind that makes a man brace for impact. "What do you mean?" I asked, keeping my tone even though my pulse was hammering in my ears. She hesitated, her gaze flickering down to her lap. "There's someone else," she said finally, her voice cracking just enough to let me know how much effort it took to say the words. Someone else. It felt like the air had been punched out of me. I sat back in my chair, trying to process what she had just said, but all I could hear was the echo of her confession bouncing around my head. "Who?" The word slipped out before I could stop it, more forceful than I intended. She looked at me then, her expression a mixture of guilt and defiance. "His name is Chris." Chris. I didn't recognize the name, but I didn't need to. I didn't ask her for details, though. I didn't need those either. The look in her eyes told me everything I needed to know. As she started to speak again, to explain or justify or whatever it was she thought she owed me, I raised a hand to stop her. "Wait," I said quietly. "Just wait." Because what she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that I already knew about Chris, and that this dinner, this carefully staged confession, wasn't just hers. It was mine too. I didn't interrupt her as she began her story, not because I wanted to hear it, but because I needed to see how far she'd go to weave her narrative. Madison's voice wavered as she tried to explain. Something about feeling stuck, about Chris understanding her in ways I didn't anymore. She talked about long conversations and how things just happened. It was all so rehearsed, her words carefully chosen, her tone just apologetic enough to seem genuine. I sat there, nodding occasionally, letting her believe she was the one in control of the situation. But inside, I was far from calm. My mind was already flipping through the memories I'd pieced together in the weeks leading up to this night. Chris wasn't a name that had come out of the blue for me. It first came up during a casual conversation she had on the phone, one I overheard in passing. "Oh, Chris said the funniest thing today." She had laughed, her voice light and carefree. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I wasn't the kind of husband to pry. But then Chris kept coming up. His name was peppered into conversations more often than felt natural, little mentions here and there that might seem harmless to someone not paying attention. "Chris recommended this book," or "Chris helped me figure out this app." She'd light up just a little more when she said his name. At first, I told myself I was imagining things. But then the phone habit started changing. Her phone, which used to sit out on the counter without a second thought, was now glued to her side. Notifications came in with increasing frequency, and she'd glance at them with the kind of smile she hadn't given me in months. I'm not proud of what I did next, but in hindsight, I'm glad I did it. One evening, while she was in the shower, I took her phone. I told myself it was just to ease my suspicions, to put my mind at rest. But what I found did the opposite. The texts between her and Chris weren't explicit, but they didn't need to be. They were full of inside jokes, long streams of messages sent late at night, and phrases like, "I needed that talk today," or "You're the only one who gets it." One particular text stuck with me. "I feel like I can finally breathe when I'm with you." That wasn't something you said to a coworker or a casual friend. That was intimacy. When I confronted her about her secrecy a few days later, she brushed it off. "You're overthinking things," she'd said with a laugh, her tone dismissive. "Chris is just a friend. Don't make it into something it's not." But I wasn't convinced, so I started paying closer attention. Her excuses for being out late grew thinner, her stories more disjointed. "It's a work thing," she'd say. Or, "I'm grabbing coffee with a friend." Sometimes, she didn't even bother with an excuse. It was clear she thought I wasn't catching on. What she didn't know was that I had already hired someone, a private investigator named Harris. He was the one who confirmed what I had suspected all along. She wasn't just grabbing coffee with Chris. There were meetups at parks, long dinners at out-of-the-way restaurants, and once, even a night at a boutique hotel downtown. I didn't confront her right away. Instead, I waited, biding my time. I wanted her to come to me, to admit what she had done. Tonight, as she sat across from me spinning her version of the story, I realized she thought this was her confession, that she was somehow in control of the narrative. But she wasn't. "Michael," she said finally, her voice shaking, I don't want to hurt you. I need you to know it wasn't about you." I smiled then, a small, tight smile that I knew didn't reach my eyes. "Is that all?" I asked, my tone calm. Too calm. She blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" I leaned forward slightly, my voice steady. "Is that everything, Maddie? Because if we're laying all the cards on the table, now's your chance." Her eyes widened slightly, and for a moment, I saw the flicker of panic. She hesitated, then nodded. "Yes," she said. "That's everything." I leaned back in my chair, my expression unreadable. "Good," I said quietly, "because I have something I'd like to share too." I let her sit in the silence for a moment, the weight of my words hanging between us like a fog. Madison fidgeted with her wine glass, her confident facade faltering. For the first time all evening, she looked genuinely uneasy. I stood slowly, taking my time to gather the plates and walk them to the sink. "You've been honest with me," I said over my shoulder, rinsing a plate as though we weren't teetering on the edge of a chasm. "So, I think it's only fair I return the favor." Madison's voice was cautious. "Michael, what do you mean?" I turned back to face her, drying my hands with a dish towel. "It's funny," I said, leaning against the counter. "You seemed so sure this was the moment you'd take control of the situation, that by admitting to Chris, you'd somehow lessen the blow." I shook my head, my lips curling into a humorless smile. "But the thing is, Maddie, I've known about Chris for weeks." Her eyes widened, and she froze in place. Whatever courage she'd mustered to stage this confession evaporated in an instant. What do you mean?" she stammered. I crossed my arms, taking in the sight of her. My wife of 15 years, the woman I'd thought I knew better than anyone, now unraveling before me. "I mean, I've known. About the texts, the meetups, the hotel, everything." Her face went pale. "Michael, it's not what you think." "Don't," I interrupted, my tone sharp enough to make her flinch. "Don't lie to me anymore, Maddie. I've seen the pictures. I've read the messages. I've heard your excuses. And you know what hurts the most? It's not even Chris. It's that you thought I wouldn't figure it out. Tears welled in her eyes, but I didn't feel any sympathy. Not anymore. Michael, please, let me explain. No, I cut her off. You don't get to explain. You had your chance to come clean, and instead, you've been feeding me half-truths, thinking you could control the narrative. Madison rose from her seat, her voice trembling. I made a mistake, she pleaded. I was confused, and A mistake? I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. A mistake is forgetting to pick up milk at the store. What you did was a series of deliberate choices. Choices you made behind my back, thinking I wouldn't notice. She stepped toward me, her hands outstretched like she could physically bridge the growing gap between us. I love you, Michael. I swear I do. Chris, he was just... Don't say he didn't mean anything, I snapped. Because if he didn't, you wouldn't have risked everything we've built for him. Her shoulders sagged, and for a moment, I thought she might collapse under the weight of it all. But then she straightened, her expression shifting to something I hadn't expected, defiance. You don't understand what it's like, she said, her voice steadying, to feel invisible, to wake up every day and wonder if anyone truly sees you. I stared at her, incredulous. Invisible? You felt invisible in this house, in this marriage? After everything we've done, after everything I've given you? I wasn't blaming you, she said quickly, though her tone carried more bite than apology. I'm just saying, I got lost. And Chris, he made me feel alive again. The words hit me harder than I thought they would. Alive. As if our life together had been some kind of slow death. I clenched my fists at my sides, trying to keep my anger in check. So that's your excuse, I said coldly. I wasn't enough for you, so you went looking for someone else. That's not what I meant, she said, her voice breaking. Michael, please, I want to fix this. I'll do whatever it takes. I held her gaze, my expression unreadable. Fix this. I repeated, my voice dangerously quiet. Maddie, you can't fix something you've already broken. Her face crumpled, the tears flowing freely now. Please, Michael, she sobbed. Don't give up on us. Don't give up on me. I stared at her for a long moment, the woman I'd built a life with, the woman I'd trusted with everything, now reduced to a pleading stranger. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to make her feel the pain she'd inflicted on me. But instead, I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. I'm not making any decisions tonight, I said finally, my tone measured. But you need to understand something, Maddie. Trust isn't something you can just patch up. It's earned. And right now, you haven't earned anything. I turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving her standing there, sobbing into her hands. As I climbed the stairs to our bedroom, I realized something that felt like both a revelation and a curse. I wasn't the same man who'd walked into this dinner, and Madison wasn't the woman I'd thought she was. Whatever came next, there was no going back to the way things were. I didn't sleep much that night. Madison stayed downstairs, her quiet sobs filtering up through the floorboards like a mournful echo of what our marriage used to be. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts a chaotic swirl of anger, sadness, and something darker, calculation. By the time the sun rose, I had a plan. When I came downstairs the next morning, Madison was still there, slumped on the couch, her eyes red and swollen. She looked up as I entered, the hope in her gaze cutting deeper than her betrayal ever could. Michael, she croaked, her voice raw. I held up a hand, cutting her off. Don't, I said, my tone flat. We'll talk later. I have things to do. Before she could respond, I grabbed my keys and left. The crisp morning air was a welcome relief from the suffocating weight of the house. I drove aimlessly for a while, letting the open road and the hum of the engine steady my nerves. Eventually, I pulled into the parking lot of a coffee shop, ordered something strong, and sat by the window to think. I opened my phone and scrolled through the notes I'd been keeping, dates, times, screenshots of texts I'd copied from her phone, and the photos the private investigator had sent me. Every piece of evidence was there, neatly cataloged. It was a strange kind of comfort, seeing it all laid out like that, as though having it organized made the betrayal easier to bear. But this wasn't just about bearing it. It was about preparation. I spent the rest of the day taking quiet, deliberate steps to protect myself. I called a lawyer, a recommendation from Harris, and scheduled a consultation. I transferred half of the funds from our joint account into one under my name, not out of malice but out of necessity. I wasn't about to leave myself vulnerable to whatever Madison might do next. By the time I returned home that evening, I felt more grounded, more in control. Madison was in the kitchen, picking at a bowl of soup. She looked up as I entered, her eyes filled with a tentative hope. "You came back," she said softly. I shrugged, setting my keys on the counter. "It's still my house, Maddie." She flinched at the coldness in my voice, but didn't respond. For a moment, the silence hung heavy between us, and then she spoke again, her voice trembling. "Michael, I want to go to counseling. Together. Please, let's try." I studied her, the woman I had loved for 15 years, now reduced to this desperate version of herself. "Counseling won't erase what you've done," I said evenly. "It won't undo the lies, the betrayal." Her tears started again, but I didn't soften. "Michael, I'll do whatever it takes," she sobbed. "Please, just give me a chance." I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "You want me to give you a chance," I said slowly. "But what about me, Maddie? Where was my chance? When you were sneaking around, lying to my face, did you think about what I deserved? Did you think about us at all?" She opened her mouth to respond, but I held up a hand. "Save it," I said, my voice firm. "I've heard enough for now." I left her there in the kitchen and went upstairs, my mind already turning to the next steps. That night, I slept in the guest room. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Over the next few days, Madison tried everything. She hovered, asking me about my day with a level of interest that felt more like desperation than genuine care. She cooked elaborate meals, left me handwritten notes apologizing for what she called her mistake, and even tried to initiate conversations about the future. But I didn't bite. I couldn't. I wasn't being cruel. I was being methodical. Every interaction, every word she said was another piece of the puzzle, another confirmation of what I already knew. And slowly, Madison started to realize that her attempts to regain control were futile. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening. I had just returned from my meeting with the lawyer, the plan for divorce papers now firmly in motion. Madison was waiting for me in the living room, her posture tense, her eyes pleading. "I told Chris it's over," she blurted out the moment I walked in. "I haven't spoken to him since. I swear, Michael, I want to fix this." I stared at her, my expression unreadable. "And you think that changes anything?" "It has to," she said, her voice cracking. "It has to mean something." "It means you're scrambling," I replied, my voice calm. "But it doesn't erase what you've done." Her face crumpled, and she sank into the couch, her sobs muffled against her hands. I watched her for a moment, the woman I had once built my entire world around, now reduced to this. Part of me wanted to comfort her, to tell her it would be okay. But I couldn't. Not anymore. "Madison," I said quietly, "you're not the only one who gets to decide what happens next." The moment the envelope landed on the table, the room seemed to grow colder. Madison stared at it as though it were a ticking bomb, her hands trembling slightly as she reached out to touch the corner. She knew what it was before she even opened it. The bold letters across the front, "Notice of divorce proceedings," were confirmation enough. I had planned the timing carefully. Ethan, our 15-year-old, was at a friend's house, and our eldest, Rachel, was out with her boyfriend. There would be no interruptions, no need to shield them from what was about to unfold. This moment was just for us. Madison looked up at me, her face a mixture of shock and devastation. "Michael," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I crossed my arms, leaning back against the counter. "You wanted to fix this, Maddie. Well, this is how we're fixing it." She shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "You can't mean this. Michael, we've been through so much. We can work through this. I'll do whatever it takes, counseling, therapy, anything. Just don't give up on us." I let her words hang in the air for a moment, the desperation in her voice hitting me harder than I expected. But it wasn't enough. Not anymore. "Do you even understand what you're asking me to forgive?" I said, my voice low and steady. "You didn't just make a mistake, Maddie. You made a series of decisions, choices that betrayed me, our marriage, and our family." "I was lost," she sobbed. "I didn't know how to deal with everything I was feeling. Chris, he was a mistake. A stupid, meaningless mistake." I shook my head, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. "You keep calling him a mistake. But Maddie, mistakes are accidents. You didn't accidentally meet him at a hotel. You didn't accidentally send him dozens of texts behind my back. You chose this. Over and over again, you chose him." Her sobs grew louder, her hands clutching the envelope like it was a lifeline. "Michael, please. I love you. I never stopped loving you." The words stung, but I refused to let them sway me. "If you loved me, Maddie, you wouldn't have done this." She opened the envelope then, her hands shaking as she read through the papers. The reality of it seemed to sink in all at once. "You've already started this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You've already made up your mind." "I had to," I replied. "You didn't leave me much of a choice." For a long moment, she just sat there, her head bowed as tears dripped onto the table. I didn't move, didn't speak. This was her moment to process, to confront the consequences of her actions. Finally, she looked up at me, her expression a mix of sorrow and defiance. "What about the kids?" she asked. "What are we supposed to tell them?" "We tell them the truth," I said firmly. "That we tried, but some things can't be undone. They deserve honesty, Maddie, even if it's hard." She nodded slowly, the fight draining out of her. "And what happens now?" "Now," I said, pushing off the counter, "we move forward. Separately." The days that followed were a blur of quiet tension. Madison tried to act normal around the kids, putting on a brave face as though nothing had changed. But Rachel, sharp as ever, sensed something was off almost immediately. "What's going on with you and Mom?" she asked me one evening after dinner. I hesitated, knowing this moment was inevitable but dreading it all the same. "Your mom and we're going through some things," I said carefully. "We've decided it's best to separate." Rachel's eyes widened, her face a mixture of shock and confusion. "Separate? You mean like divorce?" I nodded, keeping my expression calm. "Yes." Her face crumpled, and she turned away, her voice trembling. "How did this happen?" "It's complicated," I said, placing a hand on her shoulder. "But I need you to know this isn't your fault. Your mom and I both love you, and Ethan more than anything. That will never change." She nodded, sniffling, and I pulled her into a hug. "I hate this," she murmured against my chest. "So do I admitted. Madison, meanwhile, was unraveling. She tried everything to change my mind. Long letters apologizing for her actions, tearful pleas for one more chance, even suggestions of going away together to reconnect. But every gesture only reinforced how far apart we drifted. The final straw came when she called Chris in a fit of desperation, begging him to help her fix things. I only found out because Rachel overheard part of the conversation and told me. She was crying, Rachel said, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and sadness. I think she was asking him to talk to you or something. Dad, what's going on? I clenched my jaw, anger bubbling under the surface. Madison's actions had already torn apart our marriage. Now she was dragging the kids into her mess. I couldn't let it continue. That evening, I confronted her. You called him? I demanded, my voice tight with anger. She looked up at me, her face pale. Michael, I was desperate. No, I interrupted, my tone cutting. You don't get to drag him into this again. You don't get to drag our kids into this. You made your choices, Maddie. Now live with them. Her tears started again, but this time, they didn't move me. I walked away, leaving her to face the consequences of her decisions alone. The divorce proceedings moved quickly, thanks to the evidence I had gathered. The settlement was fair, but firm, equal division of assets, with primary custody of the kids going to me. Madison didn't fight it. By the end, she seemed too drained to put up a fight. When the papers were finalized, I felt an odd mix of emotions, relief, sadness, and a strange kind of liberation. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. As I packed up the last of Madison's things, I found myself pausing over a photo of us from our wedding day. We looked so happy, so full of hope. It was hard to reconcile that image with the reality of what we had become. But as I set the photo aside, I realized something. Life would go on. I would go on. And though the scars of Madison's betrayal would remain, they wouldn't define me.